because of a storm here in Peru. And then I was one of the speakers yesterday, but I was stuck in Atlanta, Georgia because of storms. So I want to thank Professor for taking my place yesterday. Thank you so much. But to be a part of the First International as well, it's a real honor. So I want to thank you. To talk about a teacher's journey, each of you have your story. Each one of you know how God has called you. And I can tell you, for me personally, I did not want to be a teacher. But when I was 2.5 years old, and I spent 3 months in the hospital, my mother and the church prayed every hour, all night, that God would heal me. And if he did, she would dedicate me to his service. Within another 2 years, well, I should tell you, the next morning, after that church prayer, and the doctors had to put something for me not to get up because I wanted to get up and play. I believe that God healed me that night. And it was my mother's promise. She shared with me, but she herself left going to church. She never took me again. So many years went by, and I was about, I guess I must have been 11, 12 years old, and my brother was injured. They took him to the emergency room, and it happened to be a relative of my mother's who was there, taking care of my brother. And when he found out that my mother, who had run away when I was about 5 years old, was living there, they sent someone to take us to church, and then to church school. And here I am in an Adventist high school. I was in a public high school. I was very happy in the junior high school, planning to be an essay secretary, busy there. And all of a sudden, I'm sent to this church school, 8 miles away. It was an unpainted army bus that picked us up on the corner. All my friends are going to this big new high school, and I have to go to this little school out in the middle of nowhere. And I'd never read the Bible, so I was third highest in the honor roll in the big high school, but I got a C in Bible. So I took my Bible that I had to have for school, and I read it under the covers at night. My mother made us go to bed on time, but I bought a flashlight, and I would just read it inside. And so little by little, God spoke to my heart. And even in high school, people told me at the church school, they said, "Oh, you're going to be a teacher." And I said, "No, I'm not going to be a teacher." But I would get taken out of my high school classes to substitute for the elementary school teachers. So in those days, there weren't so many laws. So here I am, I'm in 11th grade English, and I have to go and take care of 3rd grade while the teacher goes to the dentist. And so all through my life, I fought against being a teacher. And when our family went to West Africa, and I had a baby 3 months old, and we arrived in Liberia, I was so happy. I was going to stay home for 2 years, take care of my baby. And when school started, I taught girls PE, grades 3 to 12, 11th grade English, 6th and 8th grade math, and just took my baby with me. So I think that each of you can tell a time when you know that God called you. And I know that for me to graduate from college and go straight to West Africa, I really feel that I grew up there, that the lessons for living in this life I learned in West Africa. And for those of you who attended the first National Convention, you know that I shared a personal testimony, so you will have heard some of what I'm going to share. But I would like to share it again because that's the invitation that I had for this morning. And so just know that we went to Liberia for 6 years, to Ghana for 5.5 years, to Sierra Leone for 1.5 years. And before we went to Africa, we thought what was written in books was true. But as English teachers, I hope you've learned now that everything that's written in a book is not true. We thought Africa was going to be with, mud huts and all of that kind of thing, but that's what they told us. That's what you read in the mission stories. We arrived at an airport with air-conditioned, there's limos, air-conditioned supermarkets. I mean, it's living around the world. Until you travel, you don't really find out what the rest of the world is really like. But our school was, as we know, Adventist schools tend to be built out in the country, just like that little school where I went with the old army bus. Our school was also way out in the country. And so I want to share with you that West Africa taught me to be who I am today and took me through many different teaching experiences. But on one Friday in the morning, our lives changed. And this is what I'd like to share with you. Look out, look out, look out. The students were shouting to look out, and I was on the back porch. I was washing a wooden mortar and pestle, and I turned around, and the cat was chasing after me. You can just stay, it's okay. The cat was chasing after me, and I just picked up the pestle and threw it at the cat. And the cat turned and went off into the forest. And then some students came and said that the cat had had her kittens. Well, I knew that my children had gone to find those kittens that morning. So I went over to the science teacher's house, and his wife was the school nurse, and there were 5 people in their living room. The principal's wife, the day watchman, the senior prefect from the guys' dorm, and my daughters. And they had all been bitten by this cat. And it turned out the cat, as soon as she gave birth to her kittens, she became rabid. Evidently, she had been bitten by a rabid dog some time earlier. And my oldest daughter had found the kittens and put them in her dress and rolled up the dress and was bringing the kittens home when the mother cat grabbed her by the wrist. And the student tried to knock the cat away, and the cat bit him in the ankle, and so he took a razor blade and cut it and poured kerosene in it. And he was okay. The principal's wife had taken a preventative. But we put all 5 people into a van, and we went it's only 20 miles, but believe me, it takes a couple of hours. And we went to the hospital, and they only had medicine for 1 person. So they divided it among the 5 individuals and sent to Holland for the medicine. The duck embryo came, the duck embryo-based rabies vaccine, and my daughter was allergic, and she reacted to the medication. And maybe I do need my notes. It's hard to share personal things sometimes. The days after she was bitten and the other people were bitten were really difficult for us. But we knew the hospitals in Liberia, we knew the hospitals in Ghana. So we actually drove to Liberia, then eventually we took a plane and went to Accra, Ghana. My late husband was there interviewing to be the president of the North Ghana Mission. And so we ended up moving to Ghana. And my daughter was taking the medicine. We were trying to help her to get well, but she just got worse and worse. And then we had a military takeover, and the doctors told me that there's just no more medicine. You're going to have to take her back to the U.S. So I decided to come on my own. So I took my daughter. We went to the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists and to the National Children's Hospital, and they told me that my daughter would never get well. She was 15, and I just didn't know how to receive that information. And then it got more complicated because they decided that my husband and my other 2 children had to return to the United States as well. And so they came a few months later, and I'm the oldest of 7 children, and my brothers and sisters got married while I was in Africa. They had their babies while I was in Africa. And so my youngest brother said, Jeanette, while you're here in the United States, I'm getting married. And so he invited us to his wedding. And we were at a hospital at that time in Ohio with my daughter. So my husband, my other daughter, my son, we got in the car going to my brother's wedding in Dearborn, Michigan. We were about 8 miles from our nearest destination. And my second daughter, who was at that time 13, leaned over the seat and she said, "You're old. And you're getting old." And my husband was driving and he says, "I'm not that old, I'm just 40. And she says, "But still, I don't know what I'd do if somebody close to me were to die." And so her father started telling her about his life. He had been to school in India for a year. He was happy to work with the students. He was happy with his children. He shared his life. And then just within seconds, after it was really quiet in the car, the back right tire of the car circled out. We were in a borrowed car, and the young lady who owned the car was serving as a student missionary, so her parents loaned us her car, but they didn't check. There had been a recall for the tires, and so the back right tire circled out. We had a flat tire. Some of you probably are not so used to this idea, but my late husband was a pastor, and he was busy with his teaching and ministering, so I'm the one that learned how to fix the car. So anyway, father and son walked down the road. They didn't see an exit very soon, so they walked back, and my husband said, "Jeanette, I think you're going to have to change the tire." So I got out, put on my coat, reached into the trunk to get the lug wrench and get ready to change the tire. But a young man came across 4 lanes and drove right into the back of our car. And on that day, my husband lost his life. My 10-year-old son was on the hillside watching. My 13-year-old was in the back seat of the car. And I just remember my daughter trying, she was crying and got out of the car. I didn't realize I had been injured, but I was looking for what happened here. And I went up to the driver, and the driver just looked at me. He got out of his car and left. And I can just tell you that your faith hangs in the balance. You're a teacher, you are teachers, you've served God, and you're like, where is God? And it's really difficult. My daughter, very interestingly enough, my 13-year-old, she says, "Mom, just think about that guy. He was only 20. And all his life he's going to have to remember that he killed my father." And she was thinking about him. My son, 10 years old, wouldn't talk at all. He didn't talk for about 2 weeks. And then I talked him into going with me, and I just said, "Come on, you got to go, you got to go." And he just, no talking at all. So we went to a place where you eat pancakes, and he looked up, and he said, "God is lucky. I'm still going to love him. But if he had taken both my parents, I wouldn't love him anymore." So what I want to share with you is what helped me the most. And it's difficult because I really felt, I'm standing alone on the freeway. My husband's shoe is beside me. My daughter's in the hospital. Will your faith survive? How do you rebuild your faith? So what I did first, I'd like to share with you, and I think you can incorporate it into your own lives. You can share it with your students. But the first thing I did is try to look back to the last time that I had evidence that God was in my life. When was the last time that I know only a miracle could have done this? And so I remembered an earlier coup d'etat, which is when the soldiers take over the country. And so an earlier time, as soldiers had taken over our country when we were in Ghana, and frankly, the storekeepers hid the food because something that's $1 today when there's a coup can be $10 the next week. So they hid the foods, the market was closed, and this one morning, my husband went to school, my children wore the uniforms and went to local schools. We believe that going overseas, you should be a neighbor as people are neighbors there. And so my children went to the local school. So they put on their uniforms, the 2 girls went to school, my husband went to teach, my son was just a baby, and they went off to school, and there was no food in the pantry, there was no food in the stored cupboard. We had a screened-in cupboard with each leg was in a kerosene, like a little tin of kerosene to keep insects out and so on. It was empty. Pantry was empty. And so I didn't say anything. They went off to school, and I knelt on the floor in the kitchen, and I said, "Lord, you brought us here, You made it possible for us to stay. During the coup, foreigners were supposed to leave, but we stayed. We're 200 miles inland. There is no food for lunch. Send food. That's it. So I got up and I started working around the house. And pretty soon I heard pop, 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 because our screen door was closed, not the main door. We never closed the main door except at night. And so two girls were standing there, and each of them had big pan on their head. You know, you put the kata, and then you have the big pans with the food in it. And I was like, oh my, God heard my prayer. So I invited the girls in, and they set the pans down, and I speak the language there, so I was asking them, how much is this, how much is this? And one of the girls looked at me and she said, you don't remember me, do you? Just like what you did this morning. He said, do you remember me? And I said, no, I'm sorry, I really don't. And she told me this story. She said it was at least 6 months ago. I was on the farm with my brothers and sisters during the break, and you were driving to town, and then all of a sudden I remembered. I had been driving a little Volkswagen, and I was been going up the hill to the market, and I saw like 10, 12 children just crying and walking on the road, and then I saw one girl with this bandage all around her hand. So I had stopped my car to find out what happened, and it turned out her brother had accidentally taken the machete and cut her fingers, and 3 fingers were wrapped in, her hand was wrapped in the cloth, but these 3 fingers were just, there was a lot of blood and stuff, so I just said, get in the car. Well, I think there must have been 3 or 4 kids behind the back seat, 3 or 4 in the middle seat, and some in the front seat. We didn't have seat belts in those days. Somebody could even sit beside you on the left, and we went to the clinic. When we got to the hospital, the children were making so much noise that the doctor asked them to leave, and I had held her hand while they took a curved needle and sewed these 3 fingers back on. And I just thought, oh, she'll never be able to use her hand again. And it'll be just so bad. And then, the morning when there was no food, the morning when I knelt on the floor and said, Lord, you brought us here, we need food, she was in my house. And she showed me her hand, she showed me the scars, and she could use her fingers. And she brought food for us, not to buy, but for us to have. So if God could provide for me during a military coup 200 miles inland in Ghana, he was going to provide for me in the United States somehow. I would have to trust him. So I can just tell you that millions of events have brought each of you here, and each of you can tell your own stories about how God has finished your work, how he's answered your prayers, his promises. I have a lot of text here, but there are only 3 things I'm going to share with you. One is to look back at the last time you had evidence of God's love. The second one, I'm going to ask you to think about reading Bible stories. Yes, Bible stories. Every time you read a Bible story, it says something else. You read something more into it. And so 2 Kings chapter 4 became very important to me. The woman of Shunem. You know the story, right? Does anyone know the story of the woman of Shunem? 2 Kings chapter 4. I don't see a single hand. Okay, good, thank you. Well, let me just share with you that there is a woman that lives partway between 2 towns. And she is always trying to help the prophet. And so she is there, and the prophet tells his helper Gehazi, this woman needs something nice for her. She's doing so many nice things. And now look, her husband's built a room on top of his house so that we can stay when we travel between the 2 towns. And we have to do something nice. And they didn't know what to do for her. And so they decided she had no children. And they prayed she would have a son. And so the woman of Shunem was given a son. When we read the story, you can say kindness comes back. She was kind to the prophet. The prophet prayed, she had a son. But when the little boy was about 10 years old, according to our historic figures, he was out in the field with his father, and he got a very high fever, and he was very, very sick. So they brought the little boy to the house, and she held her son on his lap, even as I held my daughter. And I thought of what she said when he died. He actually stopped breathing. She quietly said nothing, and she went quietly up to the room, put him on the prophet's bed, and closed the door. I don't know if I could have done that. If she had declared him dead, he would have been dead. Timothy Leary, some of you know, is a psycholinguist, and he says that words freeze reality. And if she had declared him dead, he would be dead. And so she said to her husband, when she decided to go get the prophet, she said, "It shall be well." And so the story took on new meaning to me. My daughter's really sick. She didn't die, but something's wrong and I can't do anything about it. So I began to say, "It shall be well." There is a God, and it shall be well. And so I learned that from the story of the woman of Shunem. But keep reading. The woman of Shunem, when she went to find the prophet, what did she do? She asked for him to come to heal her son. He sent Gehazi, his helper, and she grabbed hold of his cloth, and she said, "You have to come." And so I also learned another lesson, because my daughter didn't get well like that little boy did in the story of the woman of Shunem. My daughter didn't get well. In fact, my daughter is 55 years old, and she's still not well. So I had to believe to hold on till Jesus comes. We have to hold on until Jesus comes. That's another part of that story. And I'm going to venture to add something else to the story. You remember Gehazi went with the rod, the prophet's rod, and he went to the little boy's room upstairs, and he could not heal the little boy. But the people downstairs didn't know that. He's up in that room. He can't heal him. The prophet comes. The prophet puts the little boy there. He puts himself on his body. He heals the little boy, but he does not go and tell the people. He sends Gehazi to tell them. And so as an administrator, I also learned that you should protect the people that work with you. Gehazi was never exposed that he couldn't do it. Elijah went down and sent him to tell the people the little boy was well. And so through the years, just those few verses from 2 Kings chapter 4, reading that story, all different meanings begin to develop. And God will do that for each of you. If you learn those Bible stories, reread them. The third and final step that I took was to claim the promises. Now remember, when I was 12, I read the Bible through with a flashlight, and I believed everything I read was really going to happen. Well, as I grew up and began to fall in love with shoes, you can't tell that now because I broke my toe, so I have to wear flat shoes right now. But I love high heel shoes. I just love shoes. Well, you get to the story of the children of Israel, their shoes didn't wear out. And the promise was that their shoes would not wear out. Well, my shoes wore out. So how could that be a promise for me? And so as I began to look at the promises, I realized that the promises were made to people in certain circumstances for certain cases, and God kept his promise. So what I can claim is that from Genesis to Revelation, God is constant. He keeps his promises. And Pastor, I've asked if you would read John 14, 1-3 for us. These are the promises that apply to all of us around the world, globally, no matter what's happening in our lives. John 14, 1-3.
Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going.
Thank you, Pastor. And so we have the promises of John 14, 1-3. We cannot lose faith. First of all, Pastor, because we believe there is a God. And the second one is that you believe in Jesus. And believe me, if you see my notes, I have texts and examples, but I'm not going to share them with you because the time is short. What I want to share with you, though, is that in Africa, I learned something about Jesus that I'd like to share with you. And that is that Jesus is our bridegroom. So first of all, there is a God. Second, you believe also in me, which is you believe in Jesus. And what I'd like to share with you is, I'm going to make it as short as possible, but it's the marriage ceremony. We went to Africa. 6 years in Liberia, then a year at Andrews, then we're back at we're in Africa. They send us to Ghana. We learned the language. 2 years have gone by. Nobody invites us to a wedding. We go to baby namings. We go to funerals. We never go to a wedding. And so one day, when I was in another district, and I also spoke that dialect, so I asked, please, why are we never invited to a wedding? And it was explained to me that the wedding is called the promise of the fool, or foolish promise. And I was like, why? And they said, well, this is what happens. A young man will see a young woman, want to marry her. He'll ask his mother. She will go to the house of the young woman, see if the mother has trained her well enough to take care of her son. And if she agrees, then she tells the young man that he can ask. So he speaks to the father of the girl, and there's a whole ceremony that would take, quite a while to explain. But finally, if the elders have agreed on both sides of the family and the two families are going to get married, the day of the wedding only involves the two families. So they walk into a courtyard, and all the families of the bride sit on one side, all the members of the groom's family sit on the other side, and they actually have a translator, even though they speak the same language. So the translator, the Ochiame, stands in the middle, and the father said, is the young man ready to promise? Is he ready to make this foolish promise? And they said, yes. So the young man comes in the center, and the father says, do you promise whatever good comes to you, it is because of our daughter, it is our credit. She is our daughter. So anything that good comes to you because of her, that is for us. Do you agree? And the young man says yes. And then it's very quiet, and the father says, through the translator, I'm cutting it really short, whatever bad comes to you, do you agree that you will take it because she's your wife? So whatever bad, that's for you because she's your wife. And then if he agrees, the wedding is, continued and they get married. And I told my husband about it, and he said, that's the answer. Because the people in West Africa have had God for 2,000 years. They just haven't had Jesus. And Jesus is the bridegroom. He made the promise of the fool for each one of us. Whatever good we do is written in the book of life. Whatever bad we do, he took it. He's our bridegroom. So Jesus made that promise for us, and we can claim that. He is our bridegroom. And then the third reason that we cannot lose faith is that there are many mansions in heaven, and there is a heaven. It is a real place. And the fourth reason, again, I'm cutting really short here, and that is that Jesus is coming again. We will see our loved ones again. Our children that are not well will be well. And you can believe that each one of you have been brought to this place. Not only today, you're here because God wants you to be here. You're teachers because God has called you to be teachers. And he has a place for you. And when he offers us this water of life, we have only to accept it. So I would like to share with you that if your faith is hanging in the balance, there is a God, there is Jesus, and it shall be well, and he is coming again. Thank you for allowing me to share. You asked if I would answer, but thank you.
Wow, I have goosebumps from that. Jeanette has been kind enough to open up this time for questions, a very personal testimony and probably the most personal parts of your life So thank you so much for sharing them. I mean, for me personally, my husband and I are in